So, let me tell you a little story. I was invited to be a part of a wedding on the bride's side, and naturally, being the trans blessing that I am, I wasn't sure what to think of that. For the record, I identify as non-binary trans-masc, at least at the moment. But to everyone around me, it's pretty obvious that I still look, well, female. At first, the bride seemed open to letting me wear something androgynous, but slowly I was fed the narrative that this would draw too much attention towards me and away from the bride, and that anything other than a dress likely wouldn't be formal enough. So, alas, I would be wearing a dress in this wedding. Now, do not weep for me. I've been at this dysphoria thing for a long time and can cope with the feelings that wearing a dress will bring me. If my masculinity isn't significantly defined by the ways in which my life experiences contradict it, then I don't know what does define it. All that being said, it got me thinking, what influences this narrative, that wearing something androgynous would be too informal? What defines formality anyway? Why is it that I and many LGBTQ+ people tend to feel excluded at formal events? Personally, I think it's my queerness, in the most general sense of the term. It's my weirdness. It's my tendency to question the norms being presented to me, especially those that are gendered and sexed. So let's examine how queerness fits into formality, and how I might fit into this wedding. First, I want to define queerness as a concept. I think laying a groundwork for this term will prepare us well to situate it into formality. And I have a bone to pick. So let's start with some definitions of queer from queer theorists, shall we? A contestation of the terms of sexual relations.
Possibilities, gaps,
A category marking the sexual as whatever the variety,
lapses and excesses of meaning,
the constituent
it demarcates not a positive,
but
in
a
sexuality,
vis-a-vis,
or
can't be made to signify monolithic. That was a lot of words. Let's break it down. The word queer has been in use since at least the 16th century to mean eccentric, odd, or of questionable character. By the late 1800s, it had evolved into being used as a slur towards feminine-presenting or gay men. It was continuously used this way for decades, slowly incorporating butch women and lesbians, trans and otherwise gender nonconforming people, until it was slowly reclaimed around the 70s and 80s by LGBT communities. As lesbian and gay theory started forming in the 90s, queer also became a theoretical term which could be used to refer to a broad range of sexual and gender minorities. Though, as evidenced by the various quotes, an exact theoretical understanding is very much up for debate. Finally, queer became a colloquial umbrella term referring to, well, all of these. Thus, we have a word whose use is variable and ambiguous, much like the concept itself. Depending on the context and the person saying it, the word queer has come to signify many different but culturally overlapping ideas. Personally, I think queerness has to be something more than just indicating gender and sexual minorities. As Halperin states, I think it's a way of being, it's a positionality. It's a rejection of the status quo, a questioning of what is and what can be. Personally, I don't believe my queerness is a result of my sexuality or gender nonconformity. Rather, it is the point of origin of those two things, or perhaps the expression of those things, as well as many other aspects of my being. My queerness is the inherent desire in me to ask questions, to challenge what I know. My queerness is what led me to discover my gender and sexuality. And although I would never attempt to take away someone's identification with the word queer, I do believe it's possible to be a sexual or gender minority without necessarily being queer. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Let me explain. Queer's original use plays a lot into my understanding of it now. When used to mean odd, strange, unusual, queer had a negative connotation. If you were feeling queer, you probably weren't feeling good. If someone was acting queer, it was probably someone that made you uncomfortable. This negative connotation made it a particularly good slur when weaponized against certain groups. When it was first reclaimed, it was kind of radical, the message being, you can't shame me into conformity. I claim my nonconformity for myself. However, the Western world of today is relatively accepting of some gender and sexual minorities, provided you otherwise assimilate into normative society and are relatively privileged / you are a part of another marginalized group. Think cis white gay men and women, maybe passing binary trans people, and the like. If you fit this description, congrats! You're one of the good ones. But perhaps in this position, queer is no longer the best description of how you fit into society. In the article Queer Unions, Same-Sex Spouses Marrying Tradition and Innovation, Adam Isaiah Green analyzes the ways in which gay and lesbian marriage both challenges and reinforces heteronormativity. Green says that, quote, queer theorists fundamentally reject same-sex marriage because, in part, the making of the marital subject constitutes a normalizing process that assimilates queers to heteronormativity, including the categories of gender, the doctrinaire coupling of sex and love, the valorization of monogamy, and the institutionalization of the nuclear family. And he quotes Edelbrick saying, quote, being queer is more than setting up house, sleeping with a person of the same gender, and seeking state approval for doing so. Being queer means pushing the parameters of sex, sexuality, and family, and in the process, transforming the very fabric of society. That being said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being LGBT+ and not necessarily being queer. You don't have to be queer if you don't want to. Not everyone is cut out or able to push the veil all the time. Not everyone is interested in doing so. Green's interviews with married gay men and women also speak to the normalizing power of assimilation, how people in their lives began understanding homosexual relationships as similar to their own because they had gone through the marriage process. Plus, they were able to access all kinds of legal benefits, and I think those are all good things. I'm not trying to take the term queer away from anyone, and you can absolutely be one of the more accepted identities I listed earlier, get married, participate in heteronormative society, and still be queer or identify with the term. However, towards the end of the alphabet soup, right around when the Q appears and beyond, is where queerness really isn't a choice anymore. If you're non-binary, ace, intersex, pansexual, etc., you are pretty much considered queer whether you want to be or not. Your existence is perceived as inherently odd, eccentric, or questionable. There is no space for you to assimilate. The language of your assimilation has not yet been created, though I believe we're moving that way for many of these communities. The more us queers challenge the normative, the more space we create for gender and sexual minorities to exist within normativity. And again, I don't believe that's a bad place to be. Sometimes that's where I want to be. Sometimes I want to go to a formal event, or any other place for that matter, and be myself and not necessarily be the queer in the room. I think queer's use as a colloquial umbrella term emerged mostly because it's a succinct single word that signifies a wide range of identities, much better than the alphabet soup in that regard. But I kind of wish we'd stop using it that way, because I think it kind of misses the point. What should we use instead? I don't know. It's not my job to come up with new words. It's my job to police your words, to trample on your freedom of speech, if you will. Truly, the end goal for the gay agenda is that we dissolve the meanings of all words until language ceases to exist entirely. Only then will we have reached woke utopia. Now, like I'm sure many other people in the alphabet soup, I'm not really ready to entirely separate the word queer from sexual and gender minorities. But I'm not entirely sold on limiting its use to specific communities either. Given its history, I think it's important to recognize the inherent empowerment in the reclamation of the word by people who aren't straight and cis. I think anyone in the LGBTQ+ community can identify as queer if they personally feel it speaks to their experience. Even those of us that are relatively privileged have almost certainly dealt with harassment, shame, and the need to come out under the assumption that our identities were something that needed to be admitted to. Queerness speaks to deviancy, but it's a deviancy of a certain type, a deviancy in sex, sexuality, love, or gender. And I think that deviancy can be expressed by straight cis people, like in the case of kinky people who may otherwise identify as straight and cis, or a straight couple who have a non-traditional wedding, or a cis person who cross-dresses or pushes the boundaries of acceptable masculinity or femininity. Being queer can also mean questioning the boundaries of what it means to be cis and straight. Whether or not you identify as queer is kinda up to you. I want to pose that queerness is sex, sexuality, relationships, and gender as loci of social and cultural change. Equating it with sexual and gender minorities is both too inclusive and too exclusive. It's kind of like a Venn diagram, with queerness in one circle and gender and sexual minorities, the alphabet soup if you will, in the other. There's significant overlap between these circles, as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, ace, etc. will often necessitate a cultural queerness, but not always, and sometimes queerness is expressed by people who are otherwise considered straight and cis. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk formality. And now we take a break for your required reading, The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe Hall. Captain Ramsay, will you take Miss Gordon in to dinner? A politely crooked arm. Delighted, Miss Gordon. Then the solemn and very ridiculous procession. Animals marching into Noah's Ark 2 by 2, very sure of divine protection. Male and female created he them! Stephen's skirt would be long, and her foot might get entangled, and she with but one free hand at her disposal. The procession would stop, and she would have stopped it. Intolerable thought, she had stopped the procession. I'm so sorry, Captain Ramsay. I say, can I help you? No, it's really all right. I think I can manage. But oh, the utter confusion of spirit, the humiliating feeling that someone must be laughing, the resentment at having to cling to his arm for support, while Captain Ramsay looked patient. Not much damage. I think you've just torn the frill. But I often wonder how you women manage. Imagine a man in a dress like that. Too awful to think of. Imagine me in it. Then a laugh. Not unkindly, but a trifle self-conscious, and rather more than a trifle complacent. Safely steered to her seat at the long dinner table, Stephen would struggle to smile and talk brightly, while her partner would think, Lord, she's heavy in hand. I wish I had the mother. Now there's a lovely woman. And Stephen would think, I'm a bore. Why is it? Then, but if I were he, I wouldn't be a bore. I could just be myself. I'd feel perfectly natural. Her face would grow splotched with resentment and worry. She would feel her neck flush and her hands become awkward. Embarrassed, she would sit staring down at her hands, which would seem to be growing more and more awkward. No escape! No escape! Captain Ramsay was kind-hearted. He would try very hard to be complimentary. His gray eyes would try to express admiration, polite admiration, as they rested on Stephen. His voice would sound softer and more confidential, the voice that nice men reserve for good women, protective, respectful, yet a little sex-conscious, a little expectant of a tentative response. But Stephen would feel herself growing more rigid with every kind word and gallant allusion. Openly hostile she'd be feeling, as poor Captain Ramsay or some other victim was manfully trying to do his duty. I hope this required reading gives you some insight into what I, and likely many other trans and non-binary people, typically feel during formal occasions, especially those that have lots of rules and expectations about gender. In considering this wedding, formality, and how queerness might fit into both, I found myself asking what actually constitutes formality. The quoted example represents a formal dinner party between Edwardian aristocrats. I think it's safe to say that the intensity of the gender performance depicted there doesn't really reflect most modern sensibilities about formality. After all, different formal events in different cultures, contexts, and time periods have different rules and expectations. Though I can find small ways in which general Western formal codes seem to be in conflict with my gender nonconformity, such as general chivalry, men leading and helping women through doors or upstairs, the ladies' first mentality, gendered honorifics, etc., I struggled to actually define what it is about formality as a whole that really makes me uncomfortable, since the examples I just listed could also be boiled down to subtle, everyday gender signifiers that aren't really specific to formality. Weddings and proms being a notable exception, most Western formal events have done away with strict gender expectations aside from maybe the clothing, which perhaps explains why I was asked to wear a dress for the wedding, despite the bride being okay with using gender-neutral language to refer to me. So, let's proceed by trying to define formality. David A. Morand describes formality as one of two opposing interaction orders, or sets of conventions which are expected to be adhered to in social interactions. The opposing in this case being informality. He also clarifies that although both interaction orders, formality and informality, have expectations of conduct, formal interaction orders tend to be more restrictive. Quote, in any extremely formal context, to speak out of turn, to laugh at the wrong moment, to be improperly attired, or to pay less attention to the importance of the occasion by looking out the window or reading a newspaper is quickly noted. Informal situations, by contrast, allow more laxity and hence greater degrees of consistency violation. Variation, indeed even deviance itself, is often a hallmark of informality. Wait, what was that? So, according to this, I'm not sure you can be formal and queer. I think you can be formal and gay, or formal and trans. I think we're moving towards a world where you can be formal and non-binary. That's the world I'm currently working on. But you can't be formal and queer. If queerness is a positionality, if it is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant, if it is a cultural struggle, then it is necessarily informal. Formality demands following the rules and assimilating to the values of others. Queerness demands questioning and challenging those rules and values. Hold on a minute. The idea that queerness is necessarily informal, doesn't that sound like some shit straight people would say? That ain't it, Chief. What else you got? Well, Judith Irvine conceptualizes formality as a general term which describes 4 different aspects of social interactions which are interdependent. They are increased code structuring, code consistency, invoking positional identities, and emergence of a central situational focus. Throughout her cross-cultural analysis of many different types of formal events, she argues that formality can't be thought of as a spectrum, from informal to formal, but rather various combinations of these aspects which do not necessitate each other. Quote, "The only thing all 4 criteria have in common is that all of them concern the degree to which a social occasion is systematically organized." She goes on to argue that formal is rarely a useful analytical term without supplying a specific definition. Both Irvine and Morand point out that codes of formality can reinforce the attitudes and values of the interaction and its participants. For example, formal clothing, which must be well-fitted and kept clean and wrinkle-free, also prevents the wearer from being too physically relaxed, thus keeping her body upright in proper position. If artifacts representing relative rank are expected to be worn, that asserts the importance of a hierarchy, which must be strictly maintained. A political meeting, where speakers are expected to interrupt each other for the sake of argument, signifies an emphasis on the equality of all voices, or perhaps the loudest voices. Whereas a political meeting with a rigid speaking order, where only some are allowed to take the floor, signifies a more representative approach to government. Thus, formal practices communicate values. The codes themselves are there to communicate and reaffirm attitudes and orientations which are deemed important, and which can vary depending on the setting. A formal workplace that values egalitarianism between male and female employees won't have formal codes that demand different behaviors from women and men. But a heterosexual wedding, where gender differentiation is often more highly valued, probably will. So, do we have examples of queer formality? Formality that affirms the values of queerness? Well, maybe. I think maybe the most obvious queer formal events would be LGBTQ+ proms and weddings. These events can range from assimilationist to super queer, and perhaps you could argue that the most assimilationist of these would not qualify as queer. It's really not my place to draw a specific line, but some examples of queer formal codes might be a dress code which is not enforced by assigned gender at birth, which reaffirms the value that everyone determines their own gender and the expression of it, or pronoun pens, which signify something similar, or condoms being provided, encouraging safe sex between attendees, or perhaps wedding parties with no best man or maid of honor, emphasizing a more egalitarian approach to personal relationships. But these things don't really uphold queerness as a value as much as they attempt to be inclusive of everyone. Are there formal code structures that specifically orient participants towards queerness? Well, really, the only thing I can think of, bear with me here, is formal BDSM parties. Don't click off the video, and don't pretend you're not interested either. You may say to your friends that BDSM is freak shit, but I know you're curious. So, if you aren't familiar with much about kink communities, then you may not realize that for many, kink is a practice that exists outside the bedroom, within private and semi-private communities. You probably have one near you. And these communities sometimes have what are called high-protocol parties or dinners, where there are strict codes in place dictating the behaviors, clothing, and speaking patterns of attendees. Most of the codes are separated by role, so dominants may have a certain dress code and submissives another. Dominants may be asked to sit at a table while submissives sit on the floor. Submissives are expected to serve their dominants and may have speaking restrictions such as only speaking when spoken to or using honorifics. And high levels of respect and poise are expected from both groups. All of these codes serve to reinforce the values of a non-normative sexual or relational expression, that of chosen dominance or submission, that, through the lens of heteronormativity, seems extreme. Ironically, though, also my point about queerness, the best example of queer formality I could come up with doesn't necessarily include people who identify as LGBTQ+. I think part of the reason these BDSM parties work as queer formality is because they're private, relegated to a small group of people. They are opt-in occasions that happen behind closed doors. I think you could perhaps argue that the more queer behaviors become acceptable at formal events with open doors, the less queer those behaviors become. I guess the real question is, acceptable to whom? When these behaviors come out of the closet, pun intended, Who are they coming out to? Your friends or dominant society? Who would even represent dominant society? Your grandma? Your boss? The cultural queerness of any given behavior at any given moment would certainly be a hard thing to quantify, which is why numbers are stupid. We could go even further with queer formality if we truly wanted, and create codes that not only allowed for queerness, but specifically excluded heteronormative behaviors. Perhaps clothing typically worn by your assigned gender at birth is strictly forbidden. Everyone is required to use neopronouns, and expressions of affection must not be heterosexual. Of course, this sounds kind of ludicrous, because it is. It's just as ludicrous as any other formal code. And now we're getting to the meat of this whole thing. Formal codes are not only sexed and gendered, but also raced, embodied, and especially classed. And although I'm really only getting in the weeds on sex and gender here, all of these identity clusters can be the basis for exclusion in formal interaction orders. If a particular formal event requires guests to wear outfits that don't fit fat bodies, or only privileges white voices, or is hosted in a space that's inaccessible to those who are disabled, all those codes too, even if unintentionally, communicate values. And that's really where I find my problem. Although some formal interactions don't directly conflict with my ideas about gender, or race, or sex, or class, or embodiment, some of them do. And because they're restrictive by nature, I sometimes find myself in situations like the wedding, where I feel obligated to participate and thus reaffirm values that I disagree with. I become complicit in the exclusion of myself and others under the guise of formality. So, is formality necessarily exclusionary? Is there a way to systematically organize a social occasion which doesn't communicate values that at least one person disagrees with or feels excluded by? I would argue it would be pretty hard, if not impossible. I hate to be a bummer, but I think formal codes of any kind are bound to exclude someone. And that's okay as long as the social interaction is optional, like the BDSM parties. But often, it's not. I think it's easy for some to say,
just don't go to X if you don't like the rules. Just don't work there if you don't like it.
But sometimes you don't really have a choice. Sometimes you can't find another job. Sometimes there is no LGBTQ+ prom near you. Sometimes you'd be shamed for skipping an important event in someone else's life. Sometimes it's the only political forum for you to make your voice heard. If any of those exclude you by way of their formal codes, it's not that simple to just opt out. Unfortunately, formality is situated within a world which is unjust and unfair. Formality seems to say, behold, we are special people doing a special thing, and the only way to make something special is to make it exclusive. And don't get me wrong, I'm a human with an ego, and sometimes I like to feel special too. Sometimes I want to be a part of the club of people who know the rules, who have the clothes, who do the thing. But because of the white patriarchy, which is still so dominant in my society, especially in ideas of formality, I usually don't get to feel a part of the club. I tend to feel more like a disruption. Queer. I think at the very least, if you're creating or elaborating formal codes, you should try not to exclude anyone who you expect will be present, even if you're excluding the rest of the world. And if someone attempts to exclude you or a part of you on the basis of formality, know that that shit is made up, and it's not an excuse. Now, the wedding. I went to the wedding in a dress, like I said. And thanks to a wonderful queer-owned stitchery in my town, I was able to wear a binder hidden under the bodice of the dress, and it did really help with the dysphoria. Now, given the complexity of an event like a wedding, I'm starting to see how binary gender expectations can in some ways make things simpler. If gender rules can be assumed, it means they don't have to otherwise be encoded. Who gets dressed where is pretty easy to come up with if there's a women's and a men's dressing room. Who walks with whom, who holds whose arm, what colors do people wear, who has bouquets and who has boutonnieres. It's all so much simpler if you don't have to define those things. It kind of makes things easier. It also makes some things more convoluted. All throughout the day, as the bridal party and the groomsmen and friends prepared ourselves in the venue, I found myself between gender performances, often being asked to be the liaison between the women and the men. I had access to both spaces, and because I wasn't getting my hair and makeup done, I had extra time to help the men with setup and parking. Unpredictably, my non-binariness became the connecting tissue between the binary gender groups. In a way, it almost felt as if I was living up to a collection of non-binary histories across time and space, one of queer people fulfilling social roles that cis heterosexual people could not. And as guests started arriving, they came to me for cues, suggestions, questions, and I knew the answers. I was a part of the club. And that did feel good, in a way. Of course, during the actual ceremony, I played the visual role of bridesmaid, wearing a dress and holding flowers, but it was pretty much entirely visual. I otherwise was allowed to be non-binary. Even while wearing the dress, I didn't suddenly experience womanhood. Rather, it felt like a covert drag performance, one in which I was playing a certain character. And I didn't even hate it! Drag is fun! As it turns out, no amount of wearing a dress erased my queerness. It is internal. It is an experience. And even though it sometimes causes me difficulties, I actually kind of love it. I kind of love being the queer in the room. Wow, that took me so much longer to create than I thought it would. Yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for checking out my channel. I don't have any more videos yet, but if you're watching in the future, I should. So you can click on my channel icon and check those out. Be sure to like and subscribe if you liked it and you want to subscribe. And leave a comment if you feel like engaging. Push that engagement up. It's good for my channel, whatever. This has been Ryce. Is that a good outro? It's like the Midwest goodbye, but on a video. Like, how do you know when to hang up?